Quote, "It is not reason which is the guide of life, but custom. That alone determines the mind, in all instances, to suppose the future conformable to the past. However easy this step may seem, reason would never, to all eternity, be able to make it." End quote. Those words from David Hume, I think, really adequately sum up the nature of his philosophical project. The way we tend to understand the history of philosophy is in the form of narrative, and in this narrative, David Hume has earned a place in the annals of philosophy as Kant's awakener. And as such, he's been incorporated into the story as a figure who seems to have significance due to his effect on someone else. Kant is one of those remarkable figures who demarcates a new epoch, and the difference between a significant and a marginal figure in the history of philosophy often depends on those that they influence. Hume influenced one of the greats, Kant, therefore he becomes a significant part of the story. And it's not even really possible to understand Kant without reference to Hume. There is considerable debate up to this very day as to how Hume is to be regarded. He's usually classed among the empiricists, and with good reason. But there's an important difference from the other empiricists in Hume, insofar as he sees experience as a guide to life, but he doesn't see experience as a source of knowledge. At least not in the sense that we could ever attain something like rational certainty from experience. And so he's also classed, perhaps more accurately, as a skeptic, but Hume himself raises a nuance or a caveat to that, in that he repudiates the strong form of skepticism, Pyrrhonism, which is named after the ancient school of skeptics that originates with Pyrrho and is expressed by Sextus Empiricus. Hume advocates instead for a kind of academic skepticism, or what he calls moderate skepticism. Hume's skeptical philosophy is harnessed as a way to disabuse ourselves of nonsensical or incoherent ideas from the more abstruse metaphysical philosophers or the theologians who often use metaphysics to cloak their superstitions. But he was suspicious of the total skepticism of Pyrrhonism because it would seem that at this point skepticism even turns against reason. It turns against experience and says we can know nothing. And so Hume is an empiricist, but with a caveat to that. He's a skeptic, but with another caveat, another asterisk to that. Indeed, Hume was without a doubt an atheist, and his works not only question the doctrines of religions and the validity of miracles, and the rational truth of our moral positions derived from religion, but even our metaphysical faith in cause and effect. It would seem then that Hume was engaged in a project of tearing down idols, and in fact, he goes so far as to say that his skeptical attitude would have us put all those books to the flame that neither instruct us in rigorous and accurate reasoning nor in experimental reasoning concerning matters of fact. He says these works are nothing but sophistry and illusion. And yet, when it comes to social and political matters, Hume is far from the idol-smashing, bomb-throwing revolutionary that he might appear to be. In fact, he's generally classed as a conservative. And to make matters all the more complicated, of all the schools of philosophy who take the most influence from Hume, he was influential on both the utilitarians and the German romantics. So two very different schools of philosophical thought that almost seem driven by opposite sentiments. And for all the controversy of his opinions, Hume was regarded by those who knew him as a man of good humor. He was cheerful, he was open-hearted, and when he spoke or wrote as a contrarian, he was never without charm. His philosophy was denounced as irreligious, but his works of history were celebrated within his own lifetime. He quickly became counted among the best writers of his age. And not only that, he touched the lives of the great thinkers that lived as his contemporaries. He was praised by Diderot. He had a falling out with Rousseau when Rousseau went through a paranoiac episode. And his long friendship with Adam Smith is now regarded as one of the formative intellectual events for the creation of basically the modern world. And so in this episode, we're going to talk about Hume's life, his influences, and then do a deep dive into Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. That was the text that woke Kant from his dogmatic slumber, and it contains the major points of Hume's skepticism. And in particular, the inquiry provides an excellent point of comparison to, and contrast with, the anti-metaphysical critiques of Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's relationship to Hume is an interesting one, because Nietzsche rarely, if ever, mentions Hume, and when he does so in his published work, it's often disparaging, as well as in the unpublished notes, frankly. Nietzsche tends to class Hume among the English mechanists, whom he thinks were fundamentally misguided in their entire project. Nevertheless, Nietzsche is influenced by Kant. He's also influenced by Schopenhauer, a student of Kant, and in spite of how critical he is of Kant's philosophy, in light of all of this, it's very interesting to see the things he says about Hume, as Hume is sort of the great influence on Kant, or the poser of the challenge that Kant wanted to answer. But we're going to talk about all of that in the next episode. That will be on Nietzsche's interaction with Hume, and their similarities as regard causality, habit, and free will, as well as at least what Nietzsche thinks to be their fundamental differences. Today, though, we're going to try and meet Hume on his own terms, and we'll begin with a brief consideration of his life. David Hume was born in 1711 in Edinburgh, Scotland. The Hume family were descended from a branch of the Earl of Home, or Hume, could be spelled different ways. His father died in 1712, the very next year after he was born, but at least the young David would be modestly provided for by his inheritance. The Hume family was also Presbyterian, and David Hume received a rather religious upbringing. He attended the University of Edinburgh at only 12 years of age, and this was prodigiously young, although it should be noted this wasn't altogether uncommon at this time. It was normal for young men to enter the university in their early to mid-teens. But by the time David Hume was at his mid-teens, he was already burned out with his university education. He quit his studies a mere 3 years later and received no degree. And by the time he was in his late teens, David was already writing letters in which he wished for something like a contemplative life, such that his mind could be sufficiently strengthened by philosophy to, quote, withstand the blows of fortune, end quote. Well, wouldn't we all like to be so lucky as that, or as skilled in philosophical contemplation as that? When he was 18 years of age, Hume no longer believed in Christianity. If Hume awoke Kant from his slumber, then Locke awoke Hume. After reading Locke and Clarke, he wrote he was unable to entertain any belief in religion. Hume then returned to school to study law. After all, he needed some profession to sustain himself, and while he could, he could theoretically survive on his inheritance, but the stipend that he received was enough for basic needs and nothing more. It was sort of like he could live well if he had another source of income. Otherwise, it was like bare bones living. But once again, he quit his studies after only 3 years. Philosophy, it seemed, had captivated him, and now no such practical course of study really seemed to be able to hold his interest. But even as he sought after the contemplative life, he wasn't a hermit. He moved to London, he then went to Bristol, eventually France, and he found himself at La Flèche. And if you remember the episode we did on Descartes, that was the city where the young Descartes received his schooling at the Jesuit college. So this young atheist somehow ingratiates himself with the priests, who allow David Hume the use of their library for his work. And it's at La Flèche that the treatise on human nature was written. Hume did not publish it until 1739, when he was in his late 20s and had returned to England. And his publisher forced him to remove some of the more controversial arguments in the manuscript, namely the section on miracles, which that section later is included in the Enquiry on Human Understanding, which is what we're going to talk about in a bit here. But Hume's treatise was, relatively speaking, a success, given that he was a total unknown, without a university degree. Given all that, it's surprising he sold, any copies at all. But nevertheless, his royalties from the book sales were modest, to say the least. It still wasn't enough to sustain him. And in 1745, in an infamous incident, he took a job as a tutor for the Marquess of Annandale. Now, Hume had been warned about the Marquess before he took the job, but he needed the money, and he sort of just... I get the impression he, hoped for the best, but it soon became very clear that his employer was prone to sudden and totally unpredictable mood swings. He'd be calm one minute, and then he would fly into a rage the next minute. And in the year or so that Hume attempted to tutor him, the Marquess began to develop paranoid ideas about Hume. He pleaded with his employer's staff to help the Marquess see reason, and eventually Hume was fired, and he had to actually sue for his salary. And in the meanwhile, while this was going on, in his home city of Edinburgh, the Jacobite uprising of 1745 saw the city captured by a rebel army. So it would seem that the Age of Enlightenment still provided plenty of examples of madness. Hume eventually found a job working for a general, and with this position he was traveling to Italy. Eventually he goes back to London and publishes his Enquiries on Human Understanding and on the Principles of Morals, which is essentially sort of updated versions of the arguments in the treatise that he had published years before. This is the beginning of Hume's most productive period. In the coming years, he wrote and published his dialogues concerning religion, his political discourses, his history of England. This was also the time period during which Hume meets Adam Smith. They became friends around 1750, and they would remain friends until Hume died. Their friendship was largely epistolary. They only rarely lived in the same place at the same time, but they exchanged letters in which they encouraged one another. They discussed philosophy and economics and politics and history. They referred to one another as the dearest of friends. Now, for as productive as Hume was, he always had this problem. He was always withholding his most sacrilegious ideas and essays. He's always wanting to publish more than he really could, and often at the request of friends or his publishers, he would have to hold back. And it seems that these people probably had Hume's best interests at heart, as Hume would be the subject of intermittent attacks from the religious zealots of British society that over the years only really increase in hostility and frequency. It was obvious enough to any careful reader, in spite of all Hume had held back from publication, that he was not a Christian, and his personal letters more or less confirm that he's an atheist. But we have to remember that Hume's more zealous critics, they don't really need confirmation that he's an atheist. Even being a deist in their eyes is a heresy. Hume still managed to receive an appointment as head librarian at the Faculty of Advocates in Edinburgh, a position in which Hume took a great deal of pride. But 3 years after this appointment, Hume began to face increasingly public charges that he was an infidel. In fact, there was a movement to indict him. Eventually, Hume left Britain once again for France, having been offered a job as secretary to the Earl of Hertford as part of the English embassy staff over in France. By this time, Hume was well known among the French intellectual circles. He received a far warmer welcome amongst the French than he had ever had from his fellow Scots or from the Englishmen. It was during this time that he met Diderot and Voltaire, and a French Contessa also became infatuated with Hume. He was invited to countless salons and dinner parties. Hume wrote that he met with such flattery and affection from the women there that he could hardly believe it. After a new ambassador was appointed, Hume returned to London for a time in 1765. During this period, he helped Rousseau, who was facing persecution in France. He helped him flee to England, he provided Rousseau with a safe house, and he helped him secure a pension. Infamously, Rousseau began to believe that Hume was plotting against him as part of a conspiracy with perhaps some other French Enlightenment figures. They were all, he had a sort of, again, as I said, a paranoid episode. And they exchanged some very nasty letters in which Hume would eventually make public in order to clear his name of these allegations that Rousseau was making about him. I suppose no good deed goes unpunished. Also, his friendship with Adam Smith was a great emotional support for Hume around this time. Smith offered him quite a bit of advice on how to deal with the situation. These were the last of Hume's wanderings. He retired to Edinburgh at almost 60 years old, and by then he was an eminent figure around whom the intellectuals and artists sort of gathered, and he lived a handful of peaceful years in the twilight of his life before he was struck with what seems to be intestinal cancer, and he quickly began to waste away. He lost a bunch of weight, and it was very ugly, but this did nothing to change his cheerful demeanor. Up until the very end, Hume was incredibly positive and seemed to face death with that kind of philosophical fearlessness that comes through in the story of Socrates, for instance. And in Will Durant's chapter on Hume in Story of Civilization, he writes the following about his death, quote, "Boswell, importunate and impertinent, insisted on putting the dying man to the question, did he not now believe in another life? Hume replied, 'It is a most unreasonable fancy that we should exist forever.' 'But,' persisted Boswell, 'surely the thought of a future state is pleasing.' 'Not at all,' answered Hume. 'It is a very gloomy thought.' Women came and begged him to believe. He diverted them with humor. He died quietly, free from much pain," said his doctor, on August 25th, 1776. Despite a heavy rain, a large crowd attended his burial. A voice was heard to remark, he was an atheist. Another answered, no matter, he was an honest man. End quote. And, it's funny, a friend of mine pointed out to me that if you Google Hume's last words, still today, you'll get among the hits this false and, frankly, defamatory story that Hume's last words were, "I'm in flames," as if, the implication is that he's telling us that, like, the hellfire he's plunging into, he's like on the threshold of death and life, and he's already, I guess, experiencing hell. It's interesting because these sorts of stories like this, is that really how it works in the Christian metaphysics? I didn't really think living people are able to be like kind of in between hell and the real world, but I digress. There does not seem to be any source for this story except Christian apologists in like the past number of decades. Basically, nothing before the 20th century. They basically just made it up out of whole cloth, and then they all cite one another, so it'll appear like there's many sources who say it, but you'll never find a primary source that says this. And as we've read, those who knew him, Boswell and Adam Smith, reported that not only did he not recant his atheism, again, he was cheerful and totally at peace with his passing until the very end. So now, before diving into the inquiry, I just want to say a brief word about the relevant influences. Obviously, the most important one is John Locke, the founder of British empiricism. And even though I've made the case Hume is probably better conceived as a skeptic in terms of his theory of knowledge, or lack thereof, I don't know, he still thinks the most justified way of living, we might say, is based on experience, even if that doesn't produce a way of knowing in the sense of rational justification. The way of knowing that it produces is very different from what we would ordinarily mean by the term knowing in philosophy. Hume's skepticism arguably is a further development from empiricism. He arrives there by the road of empiricism, but he's rather different from the other empiricists, as I've said. Locke, another importance there is that he wrote a work entitled Essay on Human Understanding. It's a very similar title to Hume's work. Hume also uses concepts from Locke, such as this division between ideas and impressions, even though he uses impressions in a slightly different way from Locke. Another influence is Nicolas Malebranche, a French Catholic priest, who had written that objects do not have the quote-unquote power to be the causes of effects. And for Malebranche, this argument serves as one of the foundations of his Occasionalism. This is the argument that God is always the effective cause of all that happens in the world. We can't understand causality from Malebranche's point of view through a purely naturalistic framework. We'll never detect the power to cause an effect, we might say. Hume is also heavily influenced in his moral theories by both Bernard Mandeville and Francis Hutcheson, which is somewhat interesting because Mandeville's theory of human nature is rather cynical, whereas Hutcheson's was more optimistic. These influences are not as relevant to discussing Hume's views on causality, though, which concern us today, but those would be the sources that you would look into for sort of a pretext or a prefiguration of Hume's moral ideas. Hutcheson, for example, is the first one to use the term the greatest good for the greatest many. And that's a principle Hume carries through in his morality that obviously then goes on to be very important for the utilitarians. Finally, Hume was, we might say, negatively influenced by the rationalists, particularly Descartes and Spinoza. Like the rest of the empiricist school, he's more or less convinced of the impotence of reason to deliver us truths about matters of fact. But before I say any more on why that is, we'll see why that is when we get into the text. So with that, let's begin. The Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. The first section of the work serves as a kind of introduction that at a cursory glance may seem relatively unimportant, but I want to spend a little bit of time going over the introductory chapter for two reasons. For one, I think it's a rhetorical masterpiece. Hume is about to make a series of arguments that are shocking, radical, seemingly destructive to all of our knowledge claims, and somehow he frames all of this, the project of the work within this opening chapter, in a way that makes his project seem not only reasonable, but also potentially beneficial to what he calls the easy and obvious philosophy that most of us hold. What we might call the philosophy of common sense, and the commonly understood claims about what is virtuous, or we might say what is useful, and so on. All of this can be served by following Hume through these skeptical arguments, he claims. But that brings us to what I would say is sort of the second point that I would make, or the second way I would try to put forward the significance of this introductory chapter, because aside from its rhetorical power, this section helps us to understand, I think, what Hume was actually setting out to do. He says openly that the more complex and abstruse philosophy ought to labor in service, in subservience to the common philosophy. And if we read between the lines here, we could come to the conclusion that Hume wishes to use abstruse philosophical reasoning to destroy our faith in abstruse philosophical reasoning. Or if not to destroy it, just simply to critique it, to show its limitations. And so he describes these two different species of philosophy. First, the easy and obvious philosophy, which, quote, considers man chiefly as born for action and as influenced in his measures by taste and sentiment, pursuing one object and avoiding another, according to the value which these objects seem to possess, and according to the light in which they present themselves. As virtue of all objects is allowed to be the most valuable, this species of philosophers paint her in the most amiable colors, borrowing all helps from poetry and eloquence, and treating their subject in an easy and obvious manner, as such as is best fitted to please the imagination and engage the affections. End quote. The proofs for this type of reasoning, if we might even call it by the name of proofs or reasoning, the proofs are by feeling. The easy and obvious philosophy of common sense makes us, quote, feel the difference between vice and virtue. This type of philosophy, quote, excites and regulates our sentiments, end quote. So notice immediately the focus on virtue in the common sense philosophy, and because again, this is a more practical way of thinking that sees the human being as a force of action rather than a deliberating rationality. And so we might think of, the 7 wise men of ancient Greece, who each have their own pithy saying, their own aphorism associated with them, or Aesop's fables, that each story is supposed to convey a moral. During Hume's own time, a writer like Samuel Johnson might have fit this mold. And in fact, they were contemporaries, and they didn't really meet or interact, but apparently Johnson hated Hume. He hated his skepticism, but we'll leave that aside. And it's worth noting that Hume classes this entire work as moral philosophy, by the way, and because the meaning, what he means by moral philosophy, doesn't just refer to morality in the strict sense, referring to ethics, but it's a work that in general concerns human action. That's what's meant by the term moral philosophy in this context. Now, the other kind of philosophy is the accurate and abstruse. And I would say that this is what characterizes the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, which is not to say that Hume is hard to read. I would say, as a matter of fact, he's one of the easier philosophers to read because he's so clear with the way that he puts things. But his reasoning is not obvious. You do have to follow along with arguments that lead you away from your immediate certainties, or what you think are your immediate certainties, and to counterintuitive propositions. And so accurate and abstruse. Accurate, it contains the word cure, originally meaning to take care or to take heed, and abstruse means far from comprehension. It comes from a Latin root meaning concealed or hidden. So the second species of philosophy is defined by going beyond the first instincts of our sentiments, proceeding with care in order to move from particular instances to general principles. Quote, "The other species of philosophers consider man in light of a reasonable rather than an active being, and endeavor to form his understanding more than cultivate his manners. They regard human nature as a subject of speculation, and with a narrow scrutiny examine it, proceeding from particular instances to general principles. They still push on their inquiries to principles more general, and rest not satisfied, till they arrive at those original principles by which, in every science, all human curiosity must be bounded. Though their speculations seem abstract and even unintelligible to common readers, they aim at the approbation of the learned and the wise, and think themselves sufficiently compensated for the labor of their whole lives if they can discover some hidden truths which may contribute to the instruction of posterity." End quote. And so each type of philosophy has its merit, Hume says. Quote, "The most perfect character is supposed to lie between those two extremes." End quote. However, the first type is commonly appreciated or even praised, whereas the other is ignored or ridiculed. And for Hume, in a way, he starts out by saying so much the better. The easy and obvious form of philosophy is rightly praised, and the abstruse and accurate is rightly treated with suspicion. Quote, "The most durable as well as the justest fame has been acquired by the easy philosophy." End quote. So the philosophy based on sentiment, which is most concerned with the practical life questions of what do we do? How do I put this to use? Those kinds of questions. It's more active in shaping human beings. It actually influences the lives of people. It's not only more agreeable, but it's also more useful. On the contrary, the abstruse philosophy, quote, "vanishes when the philosopher leaves the shade and comes into open day." End quote. So it can't easily be put to use. Sometimes it contradicts what's easy or agreeable. It goes against our core intuitions. Sometimes it contradicts our goals or our values, or it just bears no practical use for achieving these things. And so the philosopher of common sense, of intuitive truths, he can go astray, Hume says, without ruining his whole project, because he can always check his results against the common intuitions. Whereas the more profound philosopher, having abandoned the common intuitions, now proceeds according to his own logical chain, his own pathway of syllogisms, and, if he makes a wrong turn here or there, any mistake can unravel his entire project and lead him to absurdity. Hume argues we actually need the abstruse philosophy, however, as a kind of counterbalance to our normal habitual reasoning. Because what it has the power to do when we embrace more accurate, more abstruse forms of philosophical thought, we're able to safeguard ourselves against superstitions, which might be adopted among those who just go by the easy and obvious philosophy. There is a downside, though, where we could fall into metaphysical abstractions and sophistry and illusion, as Hume says, if we push too far in the direction of the abstruse philosophy. And so he thinks the two kinds of reasoning benefit one another. The reason why Hume's opening chapter, I think, is a great exercise in rhetoric is because the philosophical approach of this treatise is definitely of the abstruse type. So he knows he's going against what is intuitively true to most people. He's seducing us with the benefits of engaging in accurate and abstract philosophy with the promise that it will serve us. It will serve us in the goals that are already laid down by our sentiments, which, as we'll see, he doesn't really mean to challenge. And thus, Hume is, in a way, proposing another use for reason. Reason is valuable because it can help us check rationalism, essentially. And so Hume writes, quote, "Man is a reasonable being, and as such receives from science his proper food and nourishment. But so narrow are the bounds of human understanding that little satisfaction can be hoped for in this particular, either from the extent or security of his acquisitions. Man is a sociable no less than a reasonable being, but neither can he always enjoy company agreeable and amusing, or preserve the proper relish for them. Man is also an active being, and from that disposition, as well as from the various necessities of human life, must submit to business and occupation. But the mind requires some relaxation and cannot always support its bent to care and industry. It seems, then, that nature has pointed out a mixed kind of life as most suitable to the human race, and secretly admonished them to allow none of these biases to draw too much, so as to incapacitate them for other occupations and entertainments. "Indulge your passion for science," says she, "but let your science be human, and such as may have a direct reference to action in society. Abstruse thought and profound researches I prohibit, and will severely punish, by the pensive melancholy which they introduce, by the endless uncertainty in which they involve you, and the cold reception which your pretended discoveries shall meet with when communicated. Be a philosopher, but amidst all your philosophy be still a man." End quote. And I love the last line. I love the idea that also that nature will severely punish abstruse thought and profound researches. You can indulge a little bit, but if you do it excessively, if you abuse reason, the natural consequence that will follow is you'll become pensive and melancholy and endlessly uncertain. And where's the lie there? There isn't one. And so to be a human being, you need both. And he argues concerning many arenas of life, being human means striking a balance between the ordinary sentiments and accuracy. In every profession, accuracy increases our skill, our power, our productivity. Hume argues that as regards all the sciences, mankind, the human race improves gradually. So while it seems that abstract philosophy has no practical use, it is the spirit of accuracy that it fosters that proves useful across all domains. Quote, "One considerable advantage which results from the accurate and abstract philosophy is its subserviency to the easy and humane, which without the former can never attain a sufficient degree of exactness in its sentiments, precepts, or reasonings." End quote. And that turn of phrase, its subserviency, I think is very important. It echoes Hume's most famous phrase that reason is a handmaiden of the passions. And so the profound, the obscure forms of reasoning that all exist to serve the easy, intuitive, humane forms of reasoning. And that's useful, again, to charm the ordinary person into going along with a critique of everything he believes about the rational justification for causality. But again, I think he actually believes this, that we ought to bring abstruse philosophy into subservience to the common human good or something like this. And I think to really understand what Hume is doing, to understand his project, it's essential to understand this subservient relation of the abstract to the active in Hume. In order for his philosophical project in the Enquiry to become comprehensible, I think you have to understand that he's trying to set the two into that type of relation, or otherwise this work, I think, would be ultimately fall apart into contradictions if that weren't the case. And this is maybe the most important point. We need the abstruse philosophy precisely because so many people use abstruse metaphysical philosophy in order to cloak their superstitious or theological claims, which we might otherwise recognize instantly as unjustified. The problem is precisely the obscurity of this type of philosophy, the way in which the average person really only perceives it vaguely or darkly or in rough outline. And Hume says that's precisely why we need to become versed in this type of philosophizing, because it will demystify all the hucksterism involved there. And so he describes the territory of metaphysical philosophy as being like a dark forest in which these philosophical tricksters hide, sort of like robbers in the forest, bandits out in the forest. And we have to become excellent backwoodsmen ourselves who are able to navigate the forest. And then we can sort of outwit them. We can make the hunters into the hunted. And so then Hume moves to present his central focus in the inquiry, quote, to inquire seriously into the nature of human understanding and show from an exact analysis of its powers and capacity that it is by no means fitted for such remote and abstruse subjects, end quote. And so it seems paradoxical, but it's nonetheless, I think, easily comprehensible. It's a critique of human understanding. That could have been another potential title. In terms of the method of approach, Kant and Hume are not all that different. It's about delimiting the capabilities of reason. Hume says that we must, quote, cultivate true metaphysics with some care in order to destroy the false and adulterate, end quote. This is why the label of moderate skepticism is most appropriate for Hume. We can see that tendency towards moderation all throughout the essay. There's a healthy provisional quality to Hume's writing, I would say. He declares his intentions to map a geography of the mind, so that's the goal or the task of the inquiry. But a true Pyrrhonian skeptic might say, we don't really know anything about the operations of the mind, and therefore we can't know. Hume says instead there's no reason to despair out of our lack of knowledge, because all science proceeds gradually. Maybe we don't have a clear picture of how the mind works right now, but that doesn't mean that we won't have one in the future. And oftentimes throughout, if you read this essay, he will often say things like, I can think of no counterexample to the argument I'm raising. I know of no objection to it. But that doesn't mean that one doesn't exist. He's always reminding us we shouldn't have so much faith in our fallible human reason, thinking that because we can't think of a reason why not at this moment, that one necessarily doesn't exist. So let's move on to section 2, where we get this the first distinction that Hume makes between impressions and ideas. Impressions are perceptions of the mind, quote, when a man feels the pain of excessive heat or the pleasures of moderate warmth, end quote. So those are examples of a sort of direct, immediate perception of the mind. These are contrasted with ideas or thoughts, such as, quote, when he afterwards recalls to his memory this sensation, end quote. Now, there are all sorts of other distinctions that might come to mind for you when approaching this if you've read a bunch of philosophy. So, for example, between sensation and representation, right? This would be very important in the German idealist tradition. I would say remove all other frameworks from your mind in thinking about Hume, because, for example, the way in which Hume is using the term impression, it could include both a sensation and a representation. We would say that both are included when the eye perceives something in the visual field. The way Hume is using impressions could include sensations, representations, even wills or impulses or volitions, even feelings, such as when he says, quote, a man in a fit of anger is actuated in a very different manner from one who only thinks of that emotion. If you tell me that any person is in love, I easily understand your meaning and formed a just conception of his situation, but can never mistake that conception for the real disorders and agitations of the passion, end quote. So impressions are basically what's immediately received, and the thought or idea is when we reflect on it later and bring it to mind. It doesn't involve something being impressed into our sensations in the current moment. And so the reason why I say to throw out all previous philosophical distinctions or conceptions is that Hume actually distinguishes the two only according to one criterion, which is, in a sense, a criterion of quantity rather than quality. And as a Nietzschean, this actually attracts me in some ways. But what do I mean by that? Well, he says these are distinguished by their force or vivacity. The stronger of the two species of these perceptions of the mind is the impression. The weaker is the thought or idea. So it's a consideration of quantity because we're able to distinguish the one class of perceptions from the other on the basis that some of these perceptions comprise a greater force and the other type comprise a lesser force. So with this distinction, we have our first principle for mapping the geography of the mind. Impressions are stronger than thoughts. All are perceptions, both thoughts and impressions are perceptions, but the thought is like a weakened form of impression. The thought, whether it's a memory or the imagination of something, Hume argues it's all bounded to what has been impressed on the mind's perception already. The thought is a pale copy, it's a facsimile, it's a trace of the impression. And so all thought has its origin in impression. And while it seems at first glance that, as Hume puts it, nothing is more unbounded than thought, that thought can think anything. I mean, remember for example, the argument of Gorgias that thought can't be said to exist in the same way as existent things, because we can think of things that don't exist, like chariots racing in the sea, right? There seems to be no limit on all of the things that we can conceive of, but Hume argues that even if we do think of non-existent things, we're working with the raw material of past impressions, and we're combining the ideas that are leftover traces of those impressions, simply in novel or unexpected or unreal ways, but it's all can be sourced to an actual concrete impression of the past. So he writes, quote, "Though our thought seems to possess this unbounded liberty, we shall find upon narrower examination that it is really confined within very narrow limits, and that all this creative power of the mind amounts to no more than the faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, or diminishing the materials afforded us by the senses and experience. When we think of a golden mountain, we only join two consistent ideas, gold and mountain, with which we were formerly acquainted. A virtuous horse we can conceive, because from our own feeling we can conceive virtue, and this we may unite to the figure and shape of a horse, which is an animal familiar to us. In short, all the materials of thinking are derived either from our outward or inward sentiment. The mixture and composition of these belongs alone to the mind and will. Or, to express myself in philosophical language, all our ideas, or more feeble perceptions, are copies of our impressions, or more lively ones." End quote. And Hume gives two arguments in favor of this assertion, and at least one exception that could serve as a counter-argument in the name of intellectual honesty. First, he says, however complex an idea that we may entertain, we can always reduce it down to the simpler components that were derived from impressions. The example he uses is the idea of God. So it's a being, totally beyond understanding, infinite in all of God's qualities, but Hume says all of those qualities can be found within human minds or within human characters. Goodness, wisdom, and intelligence, we simply take the impressions that we've had that give us an inkling of these traits or qualities, and then we extend them without limit, and there you get the concept of God. And Hume says, I challenge you to find a complex idea that can't be sourced to more basic impressions in some way. Second, Hume argues, all of our ideas about things can be seen to derive from impressions because we only have thoughts based on impressions we've actually received. Just to cut to the example he uses, the blind have no ideas about the visual world. Somebody born without taste wouldn't have a concept of, sweet or spicy or whatever. A blind person can't describe colors. They wouldn't even have an idea of what different colors would be. Epiphenomena are notoriously hard to describe in terms that don't refer back to the thing being described. And thus, Hume argues, it's clear that we can have more ideas, the more types of sense impressions we're able to have, but without those avenues of sense impression, there's no basis for the ideations. And therefore, when you open up an avenue of impressions, you're also opening up an avenue of ideas, but the counter proposition is true, that without that avenue of impression, there would be no ideas. Now, he says he can think of a counterexample of this is the idea of a person who has seen all the colors except one particular shade of blue, and then you show them a sequence of shades of blue, and the shade he's not seen is missing from the sequence. And Hume thinks this person, it's at least possible, or he says it's sensible to think, that this person could intuit that this unseen shade of blue exists because he'll notice the distance between the two shades is greater than the distances between the other shades of blue. He'll perceive a gap. He could therefore come to conceive of a shade of a color he's never seen by logical inference. He says this would be a very specific case, probably a very rare case. I would even go farther and say it's probably never happened. But it's just worth it to keep in mind. I like this attitude from Hume of raising these possibilities. And it's not even really, this isn't a particularly important thought experiment in the grand scheme of the text. But I like the thought experiment on its own terms. I like thinking about it. So anyway, the next aspect of this mental geography concerns the relations of ideas. Hume thinks that ideas are connected. Ideas or thoughts are strung together. They don't just appear in a random sequence. There's a rhyme and reason to the way in which they appear in a sequence of relations. Hume writes, quote, "Even in our wildest and most wandering reveries, nay, in our very dreams, we shall find, if we reflect, that the imagination ran not altogether at adventures, but that there was still a connection upheld among the different ideas which succeeded each other. Were the loosest and freest conversation to be transcribed, there would immediately be observed something which connected it in all its transitions. Or, where this is wanting, the person who broke the thread of discourse might still inform you that there has secretly revolved in his mind a succession of thought which had gradually led him from the subject of conversation." End quote. And I can imagine all sorts of counter-arguments to this. I think Hume's somewhat experimental approach, the approach of the moderate skeptic, might be to say, once again, try it. See if it is possible to produce a totally disconnected sequence of thoughts. And perhaps if Hume had, if he'd been around long enough to read Derrida, he might have changed his mind on this point. But anyway, assuming there is some sort of necessary connection in our trains of thought, Hume thinks there are three potential types of connecting threads: resemblance, contiguity, and cause and effect. The first, resemblance, he describes with the statement, quote, "A picture naturally leads our thoughts to the original," end quote. So you see a portrait of your friend, you think of your friend. A portrait isn't the actual person. Easy enough, right? It resembles your friend, so your thought goes to that person. Next, contiguity. Hume says, quote, "The mention of one apartment in a building naturally introduces an inquiry or discourse concerning the others," end quote. So closeness, being next to something. The example of one apartment in a building, or if I talk about something that happened to me in North Carolina, maybe it brings to mind something that happened to you in South Carolina, right? Easy enough as well. And then cause and effect. Quote, "If we think of a wound, we can scarcely forbear reflecting on the pain which follows it," end quote. So this is the introduction of causality in this inquiry, which is, as I've already mentioned, a very central part of it. And there's some things to notice here. I mean, for one, it's just that the mind makes an association between two things in the form of one follows the other. So the pain follows the wound. So there's a closeness in time being expressed here, is one way to look at it. Whereas contiguity was closeness in space. This is a closeness in time, a rapid succession. And the other issue is that this is a relation of ideas, not a matter of fact. And in fact, that's the next critical distinction that Hume makes. He says, quote, "All the objects of human reason or inquiry may naturally be divided into two kinds, to wit, relations of ideas and matters of fact," end quote. As regards the relations of ideas, quote, "That the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the square of the two sides is a proposition which expresses a relation between these figures. That 3 times 5 is equal to the half of 30 expresses a relation between these numbers. Propositions of this kind are discoverable by the mere operation of thought, without dependence on what is anywhere existent in the universe. Though there were never a circle or triangle in nature, the truths demonstrated by Euclid would forever retain their certainty and evidence," end quote. Now, of course, Euclidean geometry works when you're working with these perfect shapes on a 2D plane. When you introduce curved space, it doesn't work. And since we now work within a model in physics in which space-time has a curvature, Euclidean geometry is no longer seen as universally holding true. But in a sense, that helps illustrate Hume's point. You assume a number of things to be true in an abstract sense, disconnected from reality, from the matters of fact, in order to reason according to a relation of these ideas. There's no such thing in nature as a 2D triangle, but it can exist as an idea, and therefore we can reason about it in that kind of absolute sense. But then when we come to matters of fact, the evidence for proving the truth of matters of fact can never be as strong or as unassailable, because it never produces an absolute certainty. Even if we were to demonstrate that a matter of fact is true at a given place and given time, such as I'm in Texas right now, the contrary proposition is still possible. There's no logical contradiction. It's not impossible to conceive that I could be not in Texas right now. And, depending on when you listen to this episode, at that particular time, I might not be. But this isn't the case when it comes to relations of ideas. If a relation of ideas is true, the length of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides, then the counterproposition that the hypotenuse is unequal to that sum, that can't be true. And it can't be true at some future time or in some other place either. In relations of ideas, we have mutual exclusivity, the principle of non-contradiction. It governs thought, but it doesn't govern matters of fact. Quote, that the sun will not rise tomorrow is no less intelligible a proposition and implies no more contradiction than the affirmation that it will rise. We should in vain, therefore, attempt to demonstrate its falsehood. End quote. And Hume will go on to say in the text a bit later that there are two kinds of reasoning based on these two kinds of inquiry that the mind could make: demonstrative reasoning, which is based on relations of ideas, and moral reasoning, which is based on matters of fact. Again, call to mind the broader meaning of the term moral, referring to all human action. So we figure out how to act, what to do, and so on, according to what we perceive to be the facts of the matter, but in order to demonstrate that something is true, you have to employ logic, which deals with these relations of ideas. This is where we come to perhaps the most famous idea of Hume, the problem of induction. That is to say, inductive reasoning begins from specific instances and then reasons to general truths. It's the type of reasoning we're engaged in when we do science, or for that matter, any kind of empirical thinking about the world. Hume will argue that all such inductive empirical reasoning depends on this idea of cause and effect, but cause and effect, if you'll remember, is a connection we draw between ideas. Hume will argue that we never observe cause and effect, which is a pretty funny claim. But essentially it just exists in the way that we relate ideas. We can't prove it through empiricism, even though all empiricism rests upon it. Now, Hume doesn't ever use that phrase problem of induction, but that's the term that we use for the problem that he was raising. And Hume raises this problem in section 4 of the Enquiry. But it's worth noting he goes on to try to resolve it in the very next section. And I think that's why it's so important to look at the introductory chapter and sort of the framing of Hume's project. Because I think his point is that this problem only arises within the abstruse type of philosophy. It's not solvable with the tool of philosophy. In fact, we quote-unquote solve the problem of induction every single day. Insofar as it doesn't impede us from acting, Hume would say even infants seem to be able to act according to causality. Animals, it would seem, act this way. We just do it without knowledge, without a rationally justified true belief in it. And there are radical conclusions to be drawn from this, assuming that Hume can convince us of it. Hume asks, what is the basis of establishing a matter of fact? He has said what a matter of fact is not. It's not a truth in the same sense as a relation of ideas. It's not a logical truth. It's not something that can't be otherwise. So there's no way to logically prove a matter of fact. The only way is through experience. How do we know something is true through experience? Well, one way is to receive impressions of it. But that poses another problem because, it poses the problem of how we know matters of fact beyond our immediate sphere of perception. And depending on how far you want to take it, this could pose a serious problem because how immediate does the perception have to be exactly, right? Is it just the impressions you're receiving right at this moment? If you take this too far, you could come to the conclusion that when you turn around, what the things behind you that you can't see, what basis do you have for saying that those impressions will still be there when you turn around again? And so, how do we establish a matter of fact outside of our immediate sphere of perception? Hume writes, quote, what is the nature of that evidence, which assures us of any real existence and matter of fact beyond the present testimony of our senses or the records of our memory, end quote. And further down he continues, quote, All reasonings concerning matters of fact seem to be founded on the relation of cause and effect. By means of that relation alone, we can go beyond the evidence of our memory and senses. If you were to ask a man why he believes any matter of fact which is absent, for instance, that his friend is in the country or in France, he would give you a reason, and this reason would be some other fact, as a letter received from him, or the knowledge of his former resolutions and promises. A man finding a watch or any other machine on a desert island would conclude that there had once been men on that island. All our reasonings concerning fact are of the same nature, and here it is constantly supposed that there is a connection between the present fact and that which is inferred from it." End quote. So beyond the immediate testimony of sense impression, in order to establish anything about matters of fact, we have to employ causality. It's with that relation of ideas that we're able to make sense of the world, make the facts of the world predictable and knowable. If I find a watch on the beach, as Hume says, from this I know that human beings have to have been, we could put it this way, the cause of that watch's existence. Therefore, I can infer that human beings have been there as a cause of the watch as the effect. But how does that work exactly? Hume is pressing into the framework by which we think we have factual and certain knowledge. He continues, quote, "The knowledge of this relation is not, in any instance, attained by reasonings a priori, but arises entirely from experience, when we find that any particular objects are constantly conjoined with each other. Let an object be presented to a man of ever so strong natural reason and abilities. If that object be entirely new to him, he will not be able, by the most accurate examination of its sensible qualities, to discover any of its causes and effects. Adam, though his rational faculties be supposed, at the very first, entirely perfect, could not have inferred from the fluidity, the transparency of water, that it would suffocate him, or from the light and warmth of fire that it would consume him. No object ever discovers, by the qualities which appear in the senses, either the causes which produced it or the effects which will arise from it, nor can our reason, unassisted by experience, ever draw any inference concerning real existence and matter of fact." End quote. So we have this example of Adam the first man, and we're presenting him as a kind of abstraction, as a human being who appears in the world suddenly with a complete, functional, reasoning mind. Would he be able to deduce the existence of cause and effect as a general rule? Would he even be able to deduce individual causes and effects in particular cases? His reason would have to be able to show him that when one event happens, event A, another event, event B, follows necessarily as the effect of A, so that by lighting a fire, warmth will be produced, or by striking one billiard ball into another, the second will be forced to move. Could such a being as Adam deduce this purely from reason, assuming he has no experience at all? Hume says no, because we can never derive knowledge of cause and effect just by reasoning from the qualities of an object. We have to see by direct experience how one is the cause of the other. We can't deduce it. We can't get there by syllogism, for the simple reason that we can't know what the effect of something will be until we observe it. So causes and effects are quote-unquote discoverable, but not by reason, only by experience. This is what I mean when I say that Hume will go on to make radical counterintuitive claims, right? The effect is totally different from the cause and can't be discovered in the cause or by reference to the cause. If we were presented with an object of which we had no past experience, no experience of its qualities, no experiential knowledge of where it came from or how it acts, we couldn't discern anything about the object until forming experiences with it. And so if we imagine a billiard ball moving towards another, Hume says 100 different effects could follow from this. Upon striking the other ball, the effect could be that both suddenly come to a complete stop, or that the one who hit the other one actually returns on the same course and speed. It goes back in the direction it came. Maybe it flies off in a totally new direction. Remember, we're dealing with matters of fact here. No proposed effect is logically impossible. That is, the contrary state of affairs is not disproved by observing that state of affairs. It's only experience, and repeated experience, that tells us the way that the billiard balls behave. The problem is generalizing this experience of a given cause producing a given effect to all times and all places. That cause will always produce the same effect. One way of trying to get around this is, we interpret these general causes. We extrapolate from the particular cases, again, to these general principles of, quote, elasticity, gravity, cohesion of parts, communication of motion by impulse, end quote. But all that serves to do is to kick the problem up to another level of complexity. Every form of applied mathematics rests on the faith of these universal, everywhere valid laws of nature as a kind of operating principle. But that's all that it is, an operating principle, an assumption upon which our reason can then proceed and become productive. Hume writes, quote, "When it is asked, what is the foundation of all our reasonings and conclusions concerning that relation, it may be replied in one word, experience. But if we still carry on our sifting humor and ask, what is the foundation of all conclusions from experience, this implies a new question, which may be of more difficult solution and explication. Even after we have experience of the operations of cause and effect, our conclusions from that experience are not founded on reasoning or any process of the understanding." End quote. And that's why I would quibble with people who would class Hume sort of neatly within the empiricist camp, because experience is for him not a means of knowing. If we are to define it that way, it's certainly not knowing in the sense we use the term ordinarily. We don't know this to be true. We act as though it's true, is the point he seems to be making. And that's a very different kind of claim from saying we know through experience. Because all the things we apparently know from experience have to refer to relations of ideas which are beyond experience and are in no way justified. Here the influence from Malebranche also becomes relevant. Hume follows him in attempting to show a discontinuity between the qualities we can apprehend through the senses and the, quote, secret powers of the object that we apprehend. As to what we mean by the qualities versus secret powers, an example Hume uses, quote, "Our senses inform us of the color, weight, and consistency of bread, but neither sense nor reason can ever inform us of these qualities, which fit it for the nourishment and support of a human body. If a body of like color and consistence with bread, which we have formerly eat, be presented to us, we make no scruple of repeating the experiment, and foresee with certainty like nourishment and support. There is no known connection between the sensible qualities and the secret powers, and consequently the mind is not led to form such a conclusion concerning their constant and regular conjunction by anything which it knows of their nature. As to past experience, it can be allowed to give direct and certain information of those precise objects only, and that precise period of time which fell under its cognizance. But why this experience should be extended to future times and to other objects, which for aught we know may only be in appearance similar, this is the main question on which I would insist. The bread which I formerly eat nourished me, that is, a body of some sensible qualities, was at that time endued with such secret powers. But does it follow that other bread must also nourish me at another time, and that like sensible qualities must always be attended with like secret powers? The consequence seems nowise necessary." End quote. And just as a quick aside, lest anyone say, oh, we can get over that, that whole chasm of visible effect versus secret powers. We can get over that with modern science. My counter to that is, no, you can't. Even if you can use a powerful microscope to see the inner composition of a piece of bread, you still have no way of knowing. What Hume is talking about is, at a first glance, can you know that the piece of bread you see will have the same inner composition? In fact, you could argue the old method of just taking a bite of it will be much faster and more efficient for determining that it's bread and has the same nourishing power as bread, than setting up a microscope or something like that. Because every new meeting with a phenomenon is a meeting with an appearance, with an impression, and based on its likeness to other appearances and other impressions, we make assumptions about its secret powers, which is based on past instances of encountering those sensible qualities and meeting with certain secret powers in conjunction with them. But how do we know that those same circumstances will obtain again in the future? which really we can translate all this of, the secret powers are like the effect of which the object is a cause, to just put it back into that framework of causality. So why do we believe in cause and effect? Why do we believe that these secret qualities we experience from objects with certain outward appearances that those two things will always go together, always conjoin? Why do we assume that the effect that is produced from a set of causes one day will be the same effect produced on the next day? Hume argues this is fundamentally based on the faith that the future will be conformable to the past. That's the faith on which inductive reasoning is based, rooted as it is in this relation of ideas known as cause and effect. It's a faith because it's circular reasoning. Quote, "The proof of this last supposition by probable arguments or arguments regarding existence must be evidently going in a circle and taking that for granted, which is the very point in question." End quote. So we say the future is conformable to the past. The future will be like the past. How do we know that? Because the future has always been like the past, in the past. Past futures conformed to past pasts. Therefore, future futures will conform to future pasts. It's a vicious circle. And yet we all operate according to this causal reasoning all day, every day, and Hume is not arguing against this. He says it is a just inference. Quote, "I know, in fact, that it is always inferred. But if you insist that the inference is made by a chain of reasoning, I desire you to produce that reasoning. The connection between these propositions is not intuitive. There is required a medium which may enable the mind to draw such an inference, if indeed it be drawn by reasoning and argument. What that medium is, I must confess, passes my comprehension, and it is incumbent on those to produce it who assert that it really exists, and is the origin of all our conclusions concerning matters of fact." End quote. Kant took that challenge very, very seriously, and in a real sense, this challenge is the impetus for his metaphysics. According to Hume, demonstrative reasoning cannot dispense with this philosophical bugbear of the problem of induction. This is because demonstrative reasoning can't find a logical contradiction with the proposition, quote, "that the course of nature may change, and that an object seemingly like those which we have experienced may be attended with different or contrary effects. May I not clearly and distinctly conceive that a body falling from the cloud, in which in all other respects resembles snow, has yet the taste of salt or the feeling of fire?" End quote. Contrary to what the logic bros might say to this, there's no logical contradiction here. We can conceive the possibility of a set of facts in which the cause produces different effects than we've ever experienced. It's not illogical because it's conceivable. And so Hume argues, quote, "From causes which appear similar, we expect similar effects. That is the sum of all our experimental conclusions." End quote. And Hume thinks that all attempts to get around this just end up falling back into the same inadequate reasoning. When we say, in all past instances, the same sensible qualities have been joined or conjoined with the same secret powers, we have never reached a logical justification for saying in the future they always will be conjoined with the same similar powers. Hume writes, quote, "You say that the one proposition is an inference from the other, but you must confess that the inference is not intuitive, neither is it demonstrative. Of what nature is it then? To say it is experimental is begging the question, for all inferences from experience suppose, as their foundation, that the future will resemble the past, and that similar powers will be conjoined with similar sensible qualities." End quote. Hume continues further down, quote, "It is impossible, therefore, that any arguments from experience can prove this resemblance of the past to the future, since all these arguments are founded on the supposition of that resemblance. What logic, what process of argument secures you against this supposition? My practice, you say, refutes my doubts. But you mistake the purport of my question. As an agent, I am quite satisfied in the point, but as a philosopher who has some share of curiosity, I will not say skepticism, I want to learn the foundation of this inference. No reading, no inquiry has yet been able to remove my difficulty or give me satisfaction in a matter of such importance." End quote. So again, that's why I've been pressing this point, that it's not that we know it through experience, right? Hume actually says the opposite. He says we have this supposition of cause and effect, that the future will be conformable to the past. And all of our arguments from experience are founded on this supposition. So they can't prove this resemblance of the future to the past because what we know, quote unquote, from experience is based on this as a sort of presupposition. And Hume says, look, again, even infants act as if causality exists. The infant will discover by putting his hand over a flame, fire hot, right? He will recognize certain sensible qualities. He will connect those qualities to a power which may not have been obvious from the outset, from those sensible qualities alone, in the same way that he says Adam wouldn't know that the fire would consume him just from its light and warmth. But once you have that experience, even the infant will make this association, and Hume says he'll do so without a logical argument needed. And Hume says, as an agent, as something that acts in the world, I'm quite satisfied that the future will be like the past. I'm quite satisfied to draw these inferences. But that's actually really interesting, isn't it? In a way, it's further proof that we don't have a rational basis for this type of reasoning, because before we reach the age of reasoning, we think in this manner. Therefore, quote, it is not reasoning which engages us to suppose the past resembling the future, and to expect similar effects from causes which are to appearance similar, end quote. And he concludes the fourth section, quote, I cannot now discover an argument which, it seems, was perfectly familiar to me long before I was out of my cradle, end quote. So we're not going to find the answer in the form of an argument. We're not going to find it in abstruse philosophy, frankly. The answer is custom, habit. This is Hume's solution, his way of resolving our doubts about causality. Quote, it is certain we here advance a very intelligible proposition at least, if not a true one, when we assert that, after the constant conjunction of two objects, heat and flame, for instance, weight and solidity, we are determined by custom alone to expect the one from the appearance of the other. End quote. This is very important for my argument that Hume is not advancing a theory of knowledge. It's a intelligible proposition, it's an actionable proposition, but it's not necessarily true, or at least we haven't proved it's true. It's just what our habitual reasoning tells us. Remember, Hume's task is to map the geography of the mind. That's the stated goal of this inquiry. So he's trying to tell us how the mind operates, which is a very different question from, frankly, ontology, determining what actually exists, and even in a way from epistemology. I mean, in a sense, he's prefiguring the entire German idealist tradition. I mean, in a very real sense, because Kant is all responding to Hume, they're all responding to Hume, right? But they were intensely concerned with how the mind forms its ideas or representations. And they, after Kant, divide the world of pure knowledge, things in themselves, from the world as it appears. And so Hume he's not trying to show us, justified knowledge of what actually exists, independent of the mind. He's not even really trying to justify the knowledge of the mind, which is why I say it's even separate from epistemology. He is concerned with, in practice, how is it that the mind understands things? What is the geography of the mind, yet again? And Hume says he's not going to give an ultimate explanation for that capacity that we possess, the capacity to act according to habit or custom. But he argues that when it comes to custom or habit, and really we can use these words somewhat interchangeably, habit is the great guide of human life. It's a way of drawing inferences which is actionable even if not reasonable, even if it doesn't stand up to logical scrutiny. It amounts to nothing more than saying, this is the way it's always been in the past. This is the effect that always comes from this cause in the past. We can't posit the conformability of the past to the future as a logical law. We don't even know that by experience. We can only posit this rule as, one of our customs or habits. It's in the same category as our moral customs or our daily habits, which is to say, it's something that we, through repetition, over and over again, find that it always works, so we just keep doing it. Hume writes, quote, "What then is the conclusion of the whole matter? A simple one, though it must be confessed, pretty remote from the common theories of philosophy. All belief of matter of fact or real existence is derived merely from some object present to the memory or senses, and a customary conjunction between that and some other object." Or, in other words, having found in many instances that any two kinds of objects, flame and heat, snow and cold, have always been conjoined together, if flame or snow be presented anew to the senses, the mind is carried by custom to expect heat or cold, and to believe that such a quality does exist, and will discover itself upon a nearer approach. This belief is the necessary result of placing the mind in such circumstances. End quote. Now, Hume says it may be impossible to reach a further explanation beyond this. He says that would be asking for a cause of the cause, right? So we find habit as the guide of human life. If we inquire as to the cause of that, why do we follow habit? Really, it could be an infinite regress, right? Hume doesn't really tease out this whole argument, but that's sort of the sense I get from what he's saying. But so we might ask, though, how this works, right? If there are no such necessary connections in nature, why do we draw them? Because we might say we do establish certain, what we feel to be necessary connections between, say, fire and heat, but in other cases there are connections which we find to be less certain, or other connections which we don't believe in at all. Like if you were to tell most people, I believe it's going to snow tomorrow, but the snow will be fiery and taste like salt, they would think that you're insane. Why would they think that that's not just highly improbable, but actually impossible? Well, Hume argues that there are no such connections that we can perceive in nature. What we have instead are merely conjunctions, things that happen to happen at the same time, or happen to follow one after the other. Logically speaking, that's all we have, right? And he argues further, we're actually very unlikely to posit a connection based on a single experience alone. What happens is that when two things are repeatedly conjoined, when we experience two things following one after the other over and over again, we experience the same effect after the same cause. We experience the same outward appearance coupled with the same secret powers over and over again. Each time, the sense of connection is strengthened every single time. And we begin to more habitually associate the two. So you can think about it this way. This relation of ideas is never justified at some certain absolute point. Comparable to, for example, syllogistic reasoning in which the conclusion is proved. It's deduced from the premises, and therefore we have knowledge. What this process is like is instead, again, a quantitative accumulation. It's an accumulation of experiences. And so Hume asks, in regard to all these relations of ideas within the mind, resemblance, contiguity, and causality, quote, "Does it happen in all these relations that when one of the objects is presented to the senses or memory, the mind is not only carried to the conception of the correlative, but reaches a steadier and stronger conception of it than otherwise it would have been able to attain? This seems to be the case with that belief which arises from the relation of cause and effect. And if the case be the same with the other relations or principles of associations, this may be established as a general law, which takes place in all the operations of the mind." End quote. So in our quest into the wildernesses of the mind, exploring its geography, Hume says we have found perhaps some general law or general principle of the mind, that each conjunction we perceive and then relate into a connection becomes stronger and stronger, and our belief in it grows stronger and stronger than it would have otherwise. So each sort of like neuronal link or connection, it's like a bridge we're building between the phenomena, between the objects, between a supposed cause and a supposed effect. We add on a little more to the bridge each time the conjunction happens. And this strengthens our belief in resemblance, contiguity, and yes, causality. which are to be understood in this conception of Hume's as just operations of the mind in relating its ideas, not as a way of revealing truth about the external world. Now, I suppose it could be. Hume isn't saying that necessarily isn't true. He just isn't making any claim at all about that. In the section of the idea of necessary connection, Hume will argue that while it may be appealing to attempt to justify our concepts of, for example, power, force, energy, and necessary connection insofar as they're revealed in our experience of volition, of willing, there are a number of problems with this approach as well. What he's referring to is the sense that the vulgar people have, that when I decide to move my limb, it moves. And so there's a perception of the mind that the decision of movement is conjoined with the action of movement. And perhaps that produces this idea of, for example, power, or even the very concept of a necessary connection between things, insofar as my volition and my action are connected, or they seem to be. But Hume says we couldn't have gotten the idea of a necessary connection from this, because we're ignorant of the mechanism by which this process apparently works. What's the nature of that power by which body and mind are conjoined? In fact, the union of body and mind remains one of the great mysteries of philosophy. It seems self-evident that we're not actually conscious, or we actually aren't aware of the way in which the two are conjoined. Further, when we have a volition, it's not as if the mind sends a command straight to the arm to move it. We know it has to work through nerves and muscles and so on, and because of that, sometimes we feel, he brings up the example of somebody gripped by palsy, losing control over their limbs. We also find that we don't have control over all of our parts, all of our various organs, that apparently our volition doesn't apply to everything. Quote, "We may therefore conclude from the whole, I hope, without any temerity, though with assurance, that our idea of power is not copied from any sentiment or consciousness of power within ourselves, when we give rise to animal motion or apply our limbs to their proper use and office." End quote. All of these complex ideas that we've created, if we'll remember, Hume thinks should be sourced back to an impression to make sense of it. What is the impression at the basis of this idea of necessary connection? We can't discover, quote, "any quality which binds the effect to the cause and renders the one an infallible consequence of the other. We only find that one does actually, in fact, follow the other." End quote. Therefore, those connections that we affirm most strongly, and in which we have the strongest belief, are those that we have formed through the greatest quantity of experiences of a conjunction. We do not have a natural belief in necessary connections from the experience of volition, because our experience does not actually perceive the principle or force by which volition works. It remains a mystery. It's only because the mind repeatedly sees one thing following the other that we affirm the connection or the causal relation between two things. It's only habit. This is the key for understanding both Hume's sense of the difference between belief and fiction, as well as for understanding Hume's point about probability. I'm not going to do a deep dive into the section on probability. It's actually very short, but it's enough to say that we experience certain conjunctions of impressions that don't seem to be connected 100% of the time. We experience some impressions that are conjoined with a certain effect or a certain secret power, perhaps only 50% of the time, maybe only 10% of the time. Hume questions whether there's such a thing as chance in this world. For him, the reason why we believe in chance is because we have past experiences that have shown us that sometimes an impression is conjoined with a certain effect, sometimes it isn't. And by quantifying the number of times in past experience that an effect has been conjoined with a cause, we come to a kind of numerical probability that we infer from those past experiences. And sometimes it isn't numerical. Oftentimes it's simply a vague signifier of probability that we attach to something. People here in Texas will say, when the sky looks like that, when it takes on a kind of vague and kind of sickly yellowish-greenish hue, that means there's probably a tornado coming. They just say probably because we know that our ability to predict the weather, just in general in human life, is one of the most uncertain things within our knowledge, even with the aid of modern technology. So the more a given conjunction has been strengthened, the closer it comes to becoming a belief, such that we may say that the connections that we've habitually drawn, more than all the others, are what we call our beliefs, or our truths, or simply the truth, right? That's what we think the truth is. And what Hume says is that our certainty in our beliefs comes from a feeling that is attached to one of these relations of ideas. Quote, "It follows, therefore, that the difference between fiction and belief lies in some sentiment or feeling which is annexed to the latter, not to the former, and which depends not on the will, nor can be commanded at pleasure. It must be excited by nature, like all other sentiments, and must arise from the particular situation in which the mind is placed at any particular juncture. Whenever any object is presented to the memory or senses, it immediately, by force of custom, carries the imagination to conceive that object, which is usually conjoined to it. And this conception is attended with a feeling or sentiment different from the loose reveries of the fancy. In this consists the whole nature of belief." End quote. So Hume argues that belief is not subject to the will in this conception. Belief is not something we choose, nor something we rationally decide to adopt. It's a feeling that we have that comes from a particularly strong connection that the mind has drawn. It becomes annexed to those strong connections, such that those connections appear certain to us. When we've never drawn a different set of conflicting connections, and when every single time we've found one object conjoined with another, the same one impression conjoined with another, we become certain of that connection. A feeling attached to this relation is strengthened by the repeated experience of conjunction until we feel certain of the connection and can't think otherwise. That's belief. Now, up to this point, as I have presented the argument, you may have concluded that this conception of the mind's operation could lead us to something like solipsism. But again, that isn't Hume's position. In fact, he says, quote, "Here, then, is a kind of pre-established harmony between the course of nature and the succession of our ideas. And though the powers and forces by which the former is governed be wholly unknown to us, yet our thoughts and conceptions have still, we find, gone on in the same train with the other works of nature. Custom is that principle by which this correspondence has been effected, so necessary to the subsistence of our species and the regulation of our conduct in every circumstance and occurrence of human life." End quote. The evidence, quote unquote, for this pre-established harmony is simply in the fact that custom guides human action, that infants and animals can seemingly operate without rationality or without a rational justification for drawing these inferences. To the extent that there is reason, rationality, knowing, it's not the rationalist's version of it, formal reason operating through syllogisms. If we can be said to, quote unquote, reason, we do so through this habit-forming set of connections, which is in no way justified by logic, in no way to be considered true. It's simply habitual. But the fact that nature has provided this mental framework for interacting with and operating within the world speaks to this harmony. The natural guide to action which we possess, which all living beings naturally possess, how could it fail to be in harmony with nature? Why would that be the case, that it would be out of step with nature? That would be absurd. And Hume says it is essential that we do follow it, that we do follow our natural habit of reasoning from cause and effect, because it seems evident that reason is much more fallible, it's much weaker, it's much more unreliable in sustaining us than this habitual mental activity. Quote, "I shall add for a further confirmation of the foregoing theory that as this operation of the mind, by which we infer like effects from like causes, and vice versa, is so essential to the subsistence of all human creatures, it is not probable that it could be trusted to the fallacious deductions of our reason, which is slow in its operations, appears not in any degree during the first years of infancy, and at best is, in every age and period of human life, extremely liable to error and mistake." End quote. And the example he gives is that nature gave us the innate ability to move our limbs, Without any knowledge of the nervous system or the musculature or the inner workings of the limbs, we just do it by practice. We learn to do it by practice when we're infants, and then we do it without thinking about it. That's how human life sustains itself, through all these things we do without thinking about them. Reason can deliver us all sorts of wonderful advantages, of course. But if we take reason to be a guide to life, we'll never be able to produce, for example, a rational proof of causality. We'll be forced to say that we really don't know whether or not the sun will rise tomorrow. We really don't know if the next snow will be of the hot and fiery variety or the normally cold and wet variety. And what would actually be the benefit to the human race to act as if we don't know these things? This is the way in which Hume's skepticism exists in service to the ordinary common sense moral philosophy. Through this abstruse and counterintuitive chain of reasoning, Hume has attempted to show us that reason in no way can be relied upon, in contrast to habit. In comparison to habit, reason looks like a pale, sickly, fallible thing. Quote, "No conclusions can be more agreeable to skepticism than such as make discoveries concerning the weakness and narrow limits of human reason and capacity." End quote. So this is basically the entirety of Hume's skeptical attack on epistemology. The latter sections of the Enquiry put Hume's philosophical framework into practice, address some of the important perennial questions of philosophy. For example, free will versus determinism, or as Hume puts it, liberty versus necessity. Hume is usually classed as a compatibilist, but I find him closer to Nietzsche's position, which we might call like a denialist or something. He denies, it seems to me, both libertarian free will and determinism. And this is because if we have followed the argument carefully, he's denied the premises, or he's undermined the premises of either theory. But this is where the terms and classifications can confuse us, because we might say, from a logical standpoint, you would have to deny both. You would have to say we don't have a leg to stand on for both. He's a compatibilist, quote unquote, in the sense that habitually he thinks we believe in both. He says it's true in terms of how we operate, in terms of how most people act, how they think about free will, just sort of implicitly. He'll hold that if we look carefully about what we really mean by liberty, what we really mean by necessity, we actually believe in both at the same time, and there's no contradiction between them. As for what he means by this, when we invoke necessity, we're just invoking this idea of a necessary connection between things, between causes and effects. But he's already shown that relation of ideas is in no way justified either by logic or by experience, because logic can't disprove matters of fact as an absolute contradiction, and experience actually rests on this supposition. It doesn't prove it. We just believe it habitually. But nevertheless, that's what we mean when we say something happens necessarily. We're just referring to a customary relation between objects. And on the other hand, when we say that we believe human beings have free will, what we're actually expressing is that no external force is causing a human being to act in a certain way. So long as that's true, so long as somebody is not put in chains or coerced at the point of a sword or something, then we would say that that person is free. Even if we're to draw a necessary causal connection between forces or powers within the body, such that our actions are quote-unquote determined from inside, that doesn't change what we really mean by liberty in this context, because we mean that the human being is not compelled from without. On a deeper level, though, going beyond the way that people conventionally think about these issues, again, it should be clear, Hume isn't saying that determinism is actually true, or that free will is actually true, or that these are knowable facts or something like that. He's saying by convention we hold both to be true, that in that sense they're not in contradiction. In terms of knowledge, in terms of what we can be rationally certain about, we're not justified in positing either one. When it comes to determinism, we don't have a rational basis for cause and effect, so that goes out the window. Quote, It seems evident that if all the scenes of nature were continually shifted in such a manner that no two events bore any resemblance to each other, but every object was entirely new, without any similitude to whatever had been seen before, we should never in that case have attained the least idea of necessity, or of a connection among these objects. Our idea, therefore, of necessity and causation arises entirely from the uniformity observable in the operations of nature, where similar objects are constantly conjoined together, and the mind is determined by custom to infer the one from the appearance of the other. These two circumstances form the whole of that necessity which we ascribe to matter. Beyond the constant conjunction of similar objects, and the consequent inference from one to the other, we have no notion of any necessity or connection." End quote. And when it comes to free will, on the other hand, well, then we're in the position of positing the will as a cause. We're putting ourselves in the position of affirming this act of volition as producing a necessary connection with an action. But in this case, too, the reality is that all we have is repeated conjunction. Another important point for Hume that he feels he has to address within his philosophical framework here is occasionalism, the position of Malebranche. Hume agrees with Malebranche that no finite thing can truly be a cause, since we have no basis for asserting a necessary link between the will and the effect or the action. But Malebranche then uses this argument as a premise leading to the conclusion that God must be the cause of all effects. Hume's counter to this in so many words is that we have no logical basis for using God's will as a cause of effects, no more so than the human will, or indeed any of the objects in nature. Logically speaking, we don't derive a greater insight into why, when one billiard ball hits another, it produces movement in the other billiard ball. We don't derive a greater insight by saying that God was the cause of this effect. We still have no rational understanding for how it is that God could be a cause, any more than the human will. And effectively, this is a prime example of the superstition cloaked in metaphysics that Hume saw as the robber in the forest of abstruse philosophy. We're appealing essentially to an occult quality when we appeal to the power of God, because presumably, God can do anything. It becomes a catch-all explanation, quote-unquote, that explains nothing. Another section that I'd like to touch on, if only briefly, would be Hume's critique of miracles, which was the material that he'd held back from publishing earlier in his career. This was by far the most controversial section of Hume's work. It earned the most ire from the religious zealots who tried to get Hume charged as an infidel, we might say, who tried to get him canceled. And so a miracle is, by definition, an instance of what we perceive to be a violation of the normal, necessary connections that we've drawn. And therefore it's an assertion of a matter of fact which is in no way probable, might even be considered impossible, might be a connection we've never drawn before. And Hume's argument against miracles is rather famous. It's been reduced to a formula. We may be justified in believing a miracle if that miracle is something we directly perceive in our sense impressions. But we're not justified in believing in miracles that other people only tell us about. And that's because, as Hume has already pointed out throughout the text, our senses are quite fallible. Man's knowledge of the world is, in the grand scheme of things, rather weak and pitiful. We have to proceed with care, with caution, in the knowledge that our knowledge is often inadequate. And that, again, this for Hume is the real use of skepticism, not to attack the habits which are manifestly necessary for our survival and seem to accord with nature. The point of skepticism is to prevent ourselves from becoming too enamored with the powers of reason, from falling victim to unjustified claims that are dressed up in apparently rational language. But beyond this, Hume even brings up cases of, for example, forged miracles. We can't always trust other human beings. It's not just because their senses may lie to them, they may lie to us for any number of reasons. There are just all sorts of problems with uncritically taking it for a fact what other people tell us, whenever what they tell us is completely out of line with the connections that we have found by habitual inference. Thus, Hume writes in one of his most famous sections, quote, "No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle, unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should really have happened. I weigh the one miracle against the other, and according to the superiority which I discover, I reject the greater miracle." End quote. So if it's not clear enough as we come finally near to the end of the episode, that Hume's project is not about opening the way for pseudo-philosophy or pseudoscience, I hope that passage makes it clear. Hume has tried to delineate the geography of the mind. He's come to some radical conclusions about what we actually know, or rather, what we don't know. But this isn't part of some rallying cry to abandon our habitual beliefs as though they're delusions. Working within this framework, we have plenty of ground to stand on when it comes to denying specious claims. But the way to do so is not by logically proving that a miracle can never happen. That would be a confusion of demonstrative reasoning with moral reasoning, the reasoning about matters of fact. Hume's goal from the beginning has been to tie the basis of knowledge to the impressions, and therefore to get us to have an inherent distrust in all such complex, logically elaborative theories, especially insofar as we cannot determine from which impression these ideas arose. Hume's mission statement, as it were, comes across again in the final section of the work of the academical or skeptical philosophy. And the title is to be understood to refer to a kind of skepticism associated with the Academy of Plato, specifically in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. The Academy of Plato incorporated skeptical philosophies during that time. This is a moderate skepticism, therefore, which challenges our beliefs such that we can learn which of our beliefs are justified and which are not. Hume contrasts this with Pyrrhonism, a kind of pure skepticism in which no beliefs are justified, no beliefs are credible. Hume speaks of two kinds of skepticism that arise prior to and after man begins philosophizing and doing science, before and after our inquiries. So there's skepticism antecedent to inquiry and skepticism consequent to inquiry. The antecedent skepticism that arises prior to engaging in science or logic, Hume ties this to the methodology of doubt of Descartes. It's really the desire not to be deceived about anything and to proceed with care such that you never affirm a certainty that can't be rationally justified. Now, of course, the problem with this is that this kind of certainty is impossible. So if we hold to a kind of antecedent Cartesian doubt to an absolute before trying to know anything, well, we'll never be able to arrive at knowledge, ever. Nevertheless, this type of skepticism is useful when it's moderated. It will amount to, in that case, proceeding with care, with caution. There's also a kind of skepticism that occurs after we have begun to practice science and philosophy, which is essentially the mental effect of our discoveries regarding the fallibility of the senses. So it's not so much a method of not allowing oneself to be deceived, not allowing oneself to believe in falsehoods or unjustified certainties, but rather the way Hume seems to see it is that it's a certainty of the absolute fallibility of our mental faculties and senses. Quote, "Even our senses are brought into dispute by a certain species of philosophers, and the maxims of common life are subjected to the same doubt as the most profound principles or conclusions of metaphysics and theology." End quote. Again, it almost seems as if this is precisely what Hume has done. And furthermore, didn't Descartes also doubt the senses in his kind of preparatory skepticism? Well, again, Hume would say the issue with this consequent type of skepticism, when taken to the extreme, is precisely where it's not doubtful, where it pretends to have a certainty that our senses are always fallible. And even though Hume has challenged what it is we think we know, he doesn't do so in order to challenge the senses. Again, he's basically said we should trace all of our ideas or thoughts back to the initial impression, basically back to the senses, in order to determine whether there's actually anything concrete to those ideas or thoughts, or whether they're just sort of, phantasms. Hume writes, quote, "It seems evident that men are carried by a natural instinct or prepossession to repose faith in their senses, and that without any reasoning, or even almost before the use of reason, we always suppose an external universe, which depends not on our perception, but would exist though we and every sensible creature were absent or annihilated." End quote. And, I'm reminded of Heidegger here and his assertion that it was a giant misstep in the practice of philosophy to doubt the external world or to try and prove the external world. That for him, the external world is something that you have to take as a given, so to speak. So when this skepticism carries us beyond the certainty that we find within nature, we might not say certainty, but again, just carries us beyond the habitual inferences which facilitate our action, which are, we might say, in service of us as active beings, as living beings. At that point, philosophy can no longer appeal to the certainties of nature against skepticism. It's like by unmooring itself from the habitual sort of operating premises that we find in nature, which includes the senses, that skeptical impulse now rages unchecked against all apparent certainties. Because at the end of the day, we're never going to find an absolute certainty through reason. And so skepticism, once it is unleashed, so to speak, untethered from the basis of what we at least act as though we know, that skepticism will turn against our belief in the external world and our belief in objects, and it will deliver us over to this kind of extreme, again, almost solipsistic position if there's no counterbalance to it. And Hume goes on to describe these arguments of the Pyrrhonist style of skeptics that don't just undermine the conclusions we derive from abstract philosophies, but all that we know about existence and matters of fact. And in a way, it's almost more disagreeable to Hume to do this than to cloak your superstitions in metaphysical garb. Because this Pyrrhonist style of skepticism effectively just lays waste to the distinction between truth and falsehood, whereas the moderate skeptic is concerned still with not believing in falsehood, right? The Pyrrhonian skeptic can't really affirm that project because it's all false, right? And if all beliefs are false, none of them are. No belief is particularly false. And so untethered from our natural, habitual modes of thought, we come to question all existence. The Pyrrhonian skeptic draws attention to the infinite divisibility of extension, trying to reduce to absurdity the prospect of bodies that exist in space. And he does the same thing with time. Hume says the infinite divisibility of time makes it even more palpable, the contradictions within our ideas about time. And again, that's a very old problem. I mean, this is what led the Eleatics to suggest that motion was an illusion, and many people believed them. The deep problem for Hume with such a view is that it is impracticable. If Pyrrhonism were ever rigorously put into practice, quote, "all human life must perish," end quote. Remember, Hume has made his own abstruse reasoning subservient to the obvious and common sense needs and determinations of mankind. His problem with the overly abstruse philosophy is that it tends to vanish, again, the moment the philosopher emerges from the shade, the moment he leaves the ivory tower and has to make decisions and operate within daily life. So there's a very strong pragmatic streak in Hume as well, insofar as anything which can't be put into practice, any doctrine whose practices contradict its supposed theory, or who denies man as a being of action rather than just a rational being, all of that is pretty much for Hume disproved by that very token alone. Quote, Though a Pyrrhonian may throw himself or others into a momentary amazement and confusion by his profound reasonings, the first and most trivial event in life will put to flight all his doubts and scruples, and leave him the same in every point of action and speculation, with the philosophers of every other sect, or with those who never concern themselves in any philosophical researches." End quote. And so Hume concludes this whole inquiry with exaltation for the moderate form of skepticism. Effectively, this moderate skepticism is a guide for our philosophical and scientific researches. It keeps our high-flying metaphysical ambitions in check, reminds us of our fallibility, and it keeps us from becoming detached from nature, from custom, from instincts, from the necessities of life. So this Humean skepticism aids us by helping us to remain anchored, down to earth, whereas the Pyrrhonian form of doubting is more, it's like a rationalist skepticism, and it soars up towards the clouds of metaphysical abstraction. And it's a kind of skepticism convinced that if reason can't justify something, then it can't be justified. But Hume is willing to suppose that our actions and ways of life can be justified by something other than reason. And so if we adopt this moderate skepticism, we will realize that, quote, "philosophical decisions are nothing but the reflections of common life, methodized and corrected," end quote. And thus we refer back to the considerations of the first chapter. A spirit of accuracy is valuable, especially for dealing with the necessities of life, and that we should recognize all of our ideas as following necessarily from impressions. So Hume is saying all of this philosophizing activity originally sources to our reflections on common life. These reflections are traces of the impressions we've received, and therefore we should recognize that as the ground of human life and the ground of our philosophizing. Our intellectual life has to exist in service to that, in order to help us become better in our thinking and to help our moral ideas become more accurate and methodical. It's a powerful regulative force in service of life. It becomes deranged at the point where all philosophy becomes deranged, when it thinks it can go beyond common life, and when the philosophers forget, quote, "the imperfection of those faculties which they employ, their narrow reach, and their inaccurate operations," end quote. So skepticism is supposed to continually remind us to be suspicious of reason. It's not supposed to be a tool of unbounded reason. It's not supposed to turn about and destroy what we know by experience. And so we can know if a work is a valid and useful inquiry on behalf of human understanding if it inquires either into abstract reasonings and general facts, logic and geometry and so on, or if it deals in matters of fact, history, experimental sciences. Obviously, many of the sciences involve both. This is what Hume calls earlier mixed mathematics, but there's a lot of fields of inquiry where there's both experimental elements and general principles contained in mathematical formulas. The point is not that a field can't contain both elements. The issue is whether, Hume would say, many works apparently that pose as human knowledge don't address themselves to either question. And some of the ones that do don't really address these elements, these respective elements, on their proper terms. And so if a work is not addressing itself to one of these sort of domains of human life, these domains of inquiry, then we can know it as a work of, again, hucksterism, of the works of one of those robbers in the forest. Hume gives us a formula, quote, "When we run over libraries, persuaded of these principles, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion." End quote. That concludes our episode about Hume's Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. As I said, next time we're going to compare and contrast Hume and Nietzsche, specifically on causality, free will, and habit. Join me then. Cheers. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.